The flask was the first thing I noticed. Not the human, not the delegation standing behind her in the lowered platform, not the way the pale stone of the Vithrin Accord Hall made every footstep echo a half-second longer than it should. The flask, dented metal sitting on the polished railing, 1.6 meters below every other seat in the chamber. It made no sound when she set it down. I recorded it anyway. Her name was Envo Principal Kalen Vreth. She represented humanity, a species that had held marginal signatory status in the Galactic Accord for 41 years. 37 of those years, I would later learn, had been spent building the thing that ended my career. I did not know that when she walked in. I knew the platform offset I had filed 6 weeks earlier. I knew the maintenance amendment language I had used. I knew the 47 minutes of remarks I had prepared. I did not know about the flask. She set it on the railing and did not look at it again. That was the wrong detail. A diplomat carries a personal object into a session the way some species carry ceremonial blades. It means something. You watch it. You reference it. You use it as punctuation. She put it down and turned away from it completely, and something in the back of my mind filed that as unusual and then moved on because I had a session to run. I began my address at 13:20. The Vithrin Accord Hall held 800 observers on a good day. This was not a good day for humanity. The tiered rings were full. Species I had personally invited to witness this session sat in the upper rows. Delegations from the Rithani's 4 closest allied blocks. 2 independent compact representatives who owed me procedural favors. 1 archivist from the Accord's Historical Record Division who was there to document the formal language I would use when I entered humanity's designation into the permanent file. The ceiling was 40 meters high. The stone was pale and cold and very old, and it amplified everything. I had been in this chamber for 22 years. I had dissolved 4 civilizations from Accord standing in this room. I knew how the acoustics worked. I used them. I spoke for 47 minutes. I was precise, I was unhurried. I cataloged humanity's procedural failures in the order I found most damning. The broken trade filings first, then the late census submissions, then the 3 separate occasions their delegation had requested floor time and then failed to appear, then the cultural designation I had formally entered into the Accord record 2 years prior. A marginal signatory, it read, demonstrating insufficient institutional development for full deliberative standing. I had written that language myself. I was proud of it. She sat through all of it. She did not move. She did not take notes. She did not lean toward the delegation members behind her to confer. She sat with her hands flat on the railing and watched me the way someone watches a door they have already decided to walk through. Her eyes did not carry anger. They did not carry the particular flatness species use when they have decided to endure something. She simply watched. I finished at 14:07. She picked up the flask, she took 1 slow sip, she walked out. No rebuttal, no statement, no request for the floor, no acknowledgement of the chamber, the observers, the 47 minutes I had just spent building the most thorough public record of a species' institutional failures I had constructed in 2 decades. She set the flask back on the railing for 1 moment after the sip, then picked it up again and left. I entered her departure in the session log. Envoy Principal Vreth withdrew without recognition 14:07 session time. I found it confirming. A species that cannot remain in the room when its record is read aloud is a species that understands on some level that the record is accurate. I returned to the session. I had other business. 4 minutes later, everything I had built in 22 years began to come apart. But I did not know that yet. 37 years before that session, a Rithani patrol fleet destroyed a human colony ship and filed it as navigational error. The ship was called Vessel 11. It was a colony transport running an established route between 2 human settlements in the outer tier of what the Accord then classified as developing territory. It carried 6,200 people. The patrol fleet's report listed the encounter as an unregistered vessel operating without proper corridor authorization. The report was filed at 09:14 on a Tuesday. The full Accord reviewed and accepted it at 09:23 the same morning. 9 minutes. I know this because it is in the permanent record. It was in the permanent record before I became Grand Convener. I did not file it. I did not accept it. I inherited it the way you inherit furniture. It was there when I arrived, and I had no reason to move it. I am telling you what I did not know. That is the only honest way to tell this. What I did not know was that 37 years of work had been running in response to that 9-minute window. The work was called Operation CARTFALL. It operated out of a building that did not appear on any Accord map. because it had been registered as a water reclamation maintenance node on a junction station called Naron, a gray facility 3 corridors below the Accord's secondary logistics hub, smelling of recycled air and old paper, with no windows, and no listing in any infrastructure file that a Rithani archivist would think to check. 5 people worked there for 37 years. The building smelled like a maintenance closet. The lights ran on a secondary power circuit that was technically rated for storage only. Somewhere in the walls, there was a water pipe that made a sound every 3 hours that nobody had ever fixed, because fixing it would have required filing a maintenance request that would have appeared in the station's infrastructure log. And nothing about the Naron archive sublevel was allowed to appear in any log that anyone reviewed. I am telling you this now because I spent 11 minutes silent in that chamber while a solving elder read 6,200 names aloud, and during those 11 minutes I reconstructed, in order, everything I had not known. This is that reconstruction. Her name was Kalen Vreth. She had been a logistics analyst before she became a diplomat. She had come up through the Accord's own filing system, learned it from the inside, the way you learn a house by living in it, finding where the floor creaks and where the locks stick and which windows face east. She had worked for 11 years in the Accord's secondary records division before humanity assigned her to Naron. She had never explained why she wanted the assignment. She had never explained most things. She kept a photograph on the lower left corner of her desk. It was a small thing, printed on plain stock, laminated in worn plastic that had gone slightly yellow at the edges. It showed a ship's observation deck lit from within. The passengers behind the glass were blurs of warmth. You could not see their faces. You could see that they were there, pressed up against the window the way people press against windows when they are watching something outside they want to remember, or watching something outside they do not yet know they should be afraid of. She had taped it there the first day. No one who worked in that building had ever asked her about it. People asked once. She would look at them with a particular steadiness that was not unkind and not hostile and contained no invitation for a second question, and they did not ask again. No one asked twice. The photograph was Vessel 11, the observation deck, the people behind the glass. She had filed the first document in CARTFALL 2 weeks after the 9-minute acceptance window. She had been 26 years old. The second person in that building was Dr. Os Vithrin. He was a xenocultural psychology specialist who had spent 21 years studying Rithani deliberative behavior, specifically, how the Rithani made decisions under time pressure, and what it meant when they made them fast. He had written 4 papers on the 9-minute acceptance window. None of them had been published in any journal that a Rithani archivist would read. He wrote his notes in the margins of printed documents. He had been printing documents since before portable notation was common, and he never switched. His margins were dense and small and organized in a system that made complete sense to him and nobody else. He was the one who identified the 9-minute window as the structural tell, not a mistake, not an oversight, a habit. The Rithani Accord block accepted incident reports about marginal species in under 15 minutes as a matter of institutional practice. They had done it 31 times in the 22 years I had been Grand Convener. The speed was the point. Quick acceptance meant the record was closed. Closed record meant no review mechanism. No review mechanism meant the incident lived in the permanent file exactly as filed, forever. Vithrin spent 21 years mapping every fast acceptance in the Accord's history. He called it the window. The window was always open, and humanity was not the only species that had fallen through it. That was the part that mattered most, and I did not understand it until the 11th minute of my silence. The third person was Commander Nella Forsan. She did not speak often. When she did, it was about geometry, deployment angles, node spacing, redundancy ratios. She had designed the FENWICK relay web over 14 years. FENWICK was not a weapon. It was a broadcast network, 228 nodes long, embedded inside routine Accord trade and logistics vessels over a period of a decade and a half. Each node was a standard communications relay, individually unremarkable, registered under cargo manifest codes that corresponded to legitimate equipment. Collectively, they formed a grid that could deliver a simultaneous transmission to every species in the Galactic Accord within 0.4 seconds of activation. She had drawn the deployment grid on paper. Then she burned the paper. She did this for 14 years, drew, verified, updated, burned. The final version lived only in her head, and she had tested her memory of it every morning for the last 6 months before the session by writing it out from scratch, checking it against the previous morning's version, and burning both. There were no anomalies in the final version. The fourth person was Renkal. He had built FENWICK node by node over 12 years, installing each relay during routine maintenance windows on vessels that passed through Neron Station. He had not slept more than 5 hours consecutively in the 6 months before the session. He did not complain about this. He also did not discuss it. He ate at his desk. He kept a mug of something warm in his left hand at all times and rarely drank it. His hands were very steady. People who do not sleep enough for long enough either fall apart completely or become extremely good at not showing it, and Ren Call had become extremely good. The fifth person was Taras Os. His job title in the internal CARTFALL filing system was Coalition Liaison. What this meant in practice was that for 8 years, he had been drinking terrible tea in the shared kitchen of the Selen Compact Residency, a utilitarian corridor of rooms on a junction station 17 transit hours from Neron. With representatives from 9 species, the Galactic Accord had formally designated as developing signatories. Developing signatory was the Accord's language for a species that held formal membership but no deliberative weight. You were present. You were counted. You did not affect outcomes. The Rithani bloc had been using the category to manage peripheral species for 60 years. It was efficient. It kept the membership numbers high and the actual decision pools small. Taras Os did not pitch anything to the species he met in that kitchen. He listened. He asked questions and then stayed quiet long enough for the answers to be complete, which was longer than most diplomats stayed quiet, and which most of these species had never experienced from a Galactic Accord representative. He drank the tea. The tea was made from a powder that came in packets with blurry printing on them and tasted like something that had once been adjacent to a real plant. He drank it every time it was offered. He never asked for a different cup. He was there for 8 years. The Verath had lost a water processing colony. This was not a dramatic story. That was the point. A filing error in a Rithani administrative office had reclassified a piece of Verath-registered infrastructure as unoccupied surplus territory. The reclassification had been processed under a routine maintenance review. Nobody had checked. The colony had been operating for 31 years. The people living there had 60 days to leave. The Verath had filed 3 formal objections. Each one had been accepted by the Accord in under 12 minutes. Nobody fixed the filing error. The Accord accepted the incident reports. The record was closed. The colony was gone. That was 6 years before Taras Os arrived at the Selen Compact Residency with 2 changes of clothes and a box of terrible tea packets. He sat in that kitchen and listened to a Verath elder tell the story in full. The elder spoke for 90 minutes. Os did not check the time once. At the end, he said, "We have also been waiting." The elder looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "How long?" 37 years, he said. She did not respond immediately. She poured them both more tea from the powder that tasted like nothing real, and she did not say anything for a while, and then she said, "Tell me about your ship." He told her about Vessel 11. He told her about 6,200 people and an observation deck lit from within. He told her about 9 minutes. He told her about a building that smelled like recycled air and old paper, and was not on any map. He told her about 21 years of margin notes and 14 years of a deployment grid drawn and burned each morning and 12 years of a man who did not sleep enough eating at his desk. And he told her about a woman who kept a photograph taped to the corner of her operational desk and had never explained it to anyone. The Verath elder listened to all of it. Then she said, "What do you need from us?" He told her, no speeches, no promises, no formal declarations. Just the archive, everything the Verath had filed, every objection, every suppressed incident report, every record the Accord had closed in under 15 minutes, organized, verified, and ready to be included in a transmission that had not yet been sent. She said yes that same afternoon. There were 9 species in the Selen Compact Residency. During the years, Taras Os was stationed there. The Verath said yes. The Pelavan said yes. A compact of 3 smaller species who shared a single representative, a rotating position that changed every 18 months, said yes in 2 parts, because the handoff between representatives happened mid-negotiation and Os had to start most of the conversation over, but they said yes. That was 5. Then there were 4 more, and those were harder. 2 of them had grievances that were very old, the kind of old where the people who had lived through the original event were gone, and what remained was a cultural memory, not a wound exactly, but the knowledge of where the wound had been. Os sat with those representatives for longer than the others. He did not rush the tea. He asked more questions about the original events and fewer questions about what the species wanted now, because they needed to be heard before they could think about what came next. He had been trained for this. He had been trained for it specifically. Dr. Vithran had written a set of internal CARTFALL guidelines about the difference between a species that needed to be informed and a species that needed to be witnessed. And Oss had read those guidelines until he had them in his hands rather than just his head. They said yes, eventually. The ninth species said no. They gave Oss their reasons, which were careful and specific and reflected 20 years of watching other peripheral species take risks that cost them more than they got back. He heard them out. He thanked them. He did not argue. He did not come back the next day with a different version of the same argument in different words. He left the kitchen after that conversation and sat in his room for a while and ate something from a container without tasting it, and then he filed a report to Neron saying, 9 out of 9 contacted, 8 confirmed, 1 declined, proceeding with 8. He had been authorized to proceed with fewer. He had never told the 9 species that. The 8 said yes. 2 of them later said they would observe. Observe meant they would not formally align. They would not contribute their archive. They would be present at the session under standard observer status. The same observer status Oss had filed paperwork for, and they would watch. If asked later, they would confirm that they had been there. Oss said yes to that without consulting anyone. He had been authorized to say yes for 3 years, in anticipation of exactly this. The Solvine were different. They had held formal Accord membership for 112 years. In that time, they had built a diplomatic tradition, 7th generation, which meant that the elders currently serving had been trained by elders who had been trained by elders who had been trained by the original Accord signatories. They had a particular understanding of institutional patience. They practiced it the way some species practiced physical discipline, daily, methodically, as a matter of professional identity. What they had lost was not a colony or an infrastructure project. It was a library. The Rithani had conducted an archival standardization project 40 years ago across all Accord member species. The project had been voluntary in name. In practice, it came with a set of filing reclassification codes that the Accord's automated record systems applied by default to documents that did not fit the Rithani framework for historical record organization. The Solvine had a different framework. Their historical records were organized by relational context, which events connected to which decisions led to which outcomes, rather than by date and category. The automated system could not parse relational organization. It had reclassified 3 generations of solving elder records as redundant, not destroyed, not removed, simply made unsearchable, filed under a code that the Accord's standard retrieval system skipped by default. The records still existed, technically. No one could find them through the normal process. For 40 years, the Solvine had been working around this, retrieving their own history 1 document at a time through manual requests that each had to be individually justified to an Accord archivist who did not consider this a priority. They had been filing those manual requests for 40 years. Every one of them had been accepted by the Accord in under 15 minutes. Taras Oss learned all of this over 6 months of conversations in the Selen kitchen. He did not meet the elder who mattered most until the very end. Her name was Kurath Sol. She was 206 years old. She was the eldest active diplomat in the Peripheral Compact. She had begun her diplomatic career in the same year the Archival Standardization Project reclassified her generation's records, which meant she had spent her entire professional life operating in a system that had erased the institutional memory she needed to do her job. And she had done the job anyway, because that was what her training required. She had compound eyes. The Solvine's compound eyes reflected emotion in color shifts, copper for calm, amber for interest, a deep red-brown that appeared at the edges when they were working through something significant. Oss had learned to read this the way you learn to read weather. She had read every human historical record, available through the Accord's open archive tier. Every one, not the records that humans had submitted to the Accord. Those were limited by what humanity was allowed to file under marginal signatory status. The open archive tier contained records that humans had submitted to the Accord over 41 years for translation and historical cataloging, which was a separate process from deliberative filing, and which the Rithani bloc had never thought to restrict. She had read all of it. She called Dr. Vithran at 300, station time. He was heating a meal. He still had the container in his hand when he accepted the call. The sound of the container being set down, a small, specific click of cheap composite material on a metal counter, was the first thing she heard. She said, "I have read what you do with patience. You compress it. You make it load-bearing. I did not think any species did this but us." He said, "We learned it the hard way." She said, "Yes." A pause. "Then I know which ship." She said, "Yes," within the week. Not to Taras Oss. She never negotiated through intermediaries when she could go directly. She called Dr. Vithran back at 302 mornings later, the same hour, the same station time, as if she had decided that was when serious conversations happened, and she told him what the solving would contribute. 40 years of manual retrieval requests. Every document they had pulled back from the unsearchable archive, one at a time over 4 decades. Cross-referenced by incident. Verified by the current generation of solving archivists, who had been doing this work their entire careers and were very good at it. She said, "We have been organizing this for ourselves. It is already organized, you may have it." He said, "We are grateful." She said, "Do not be grateful, be ready." He said he would pass that along. She ended the call. He stood in his kitchen at Naron for a long time after, holding the container of food he had still not eaten. 5 weeks. That was how long it took Kurath Sol to bring 7 of the 9 peripheral compact species into formal documentary alignment. Not persuasion, coordination. The species had been sitting on their archives for years, some for 8 years, some for 20. They had not been waiting for permission. They had been waiting for a structure that could carry what they had. CRTFALL was that structure. The 8th species, the one that had said no to us in the kitchen, did not change their answer. Their reasons remained careful and specific, and Kurath Sol respected them. She did not try again. The 9th species, who had said only that they would observe, confirmed their observer status through a standard accord form that OS filed on their behalf. Standard language. Unremarkable. 2 more species asked to observe after the word spread through the compact's informal channels. They had not been in the kitchen. They had not been contacted. They had simply heard, through the particular network of peripheral species who had learned to talk to each other outside of accord-monitored channels, that something was being built, and they wanted to see it. OS filed their observer forms too. The coalition was in position 41 days before Soon filed the platform offset amendment. He filed the amendment on a Tuesday. He approved it himself in the afternoon between 2 other routine filings. He found the language elegant. He moved on to the next item. Taras Os received the final species confirmation on the same Tuesday. He was in the Selen kitchen, drinking the terrible tea for the last time before he began the transit back to Naron. He did not record his reaction in any CARTFALL document. There was nothing to record. It had gone exactly as planned. He finished the tea, he rinsed the cup, he left. When I reviewed the Peripheral Compact's attendance roster for the session, I noted nothing unusual. 7 of the 9 species had filed observer forms using identical language. Standard procedural observer request, it read. No deliberative action intended. I had seen this language 10,000 times. I had written some versions of it. I approved the 7 forms in 11 minutes. I would spend a great deal of time later thinking about those 11 minutes. The session record shows that I approved the forms on a Tuesday afternoon between a trade filing dispute and a maintenance review. I have no memory of the specific moment. It was a formality. It was one of 53 forms I processed that day. The session record also shows the timestamp for Taras Os's first residency filing at Selen, 8 years prior. Standard cultural exchange notification, it reads. No deliberative action intended. I approved that one too, in 11 minutes. 8 years before he drank the last cup of terrible tea and rinsed the cup and caught his transit. They had written the response to my objection before I knew I would file one. I do not mean that as a figure of speech. Before the session, Vreth's team had built a filing appendix, 312 entries long. Containing pre-drafted counterarguments for every procedural challenge the Rithani Dominion was statistically likely to raise following a FENWICK broadcast event. The appendix was organized by challenge type, cross-referenced to the relevant Accord articles, and flagged with the exact language required to trigger mandatory review under each article's review clause. It had been compiled by Dr. Vithran and 2 CARTFALL archivists over 4 years. It had been reviewed and approved by Accord procedural consultants who had been embedded in the system long enough to know which counterarguments held and which ones did not. When I filed my objection, which I did 3 hours after the broadcast when my hands had stopped shaking enough to type, it arrived in the review queue already answered, not in draft, in the permanent record, as Exhibit 312. I found out from my systems analyst. She told me the way you tell someone something they need to know, but that you understand will be difficult to hear, which is to say, quietly and without elaboration. She said, your objection has been formally answered. It is Exhibit 312. I said, of what? She said, of the counterfiling archive. It was pre-submitted this morning. There are 312 entries. I sat with that for a while. The FENWICK network activated at 14:11 station time, 4 minutes after Envy Principal Vreth left the chamber. I was in the middle of reviewing the afternoon session agenda when the monitoring system flagged it. High-volume simultaneous broadcast origin 228 nodes, all pinging within the same 0.4-second window. The flag was tagged routine. My system used that word because the system had no other word for a simultaneous multi-node broadcast. It had never seen one before. The closest category it had was routine, and so that was what it used. I flagged it for my system's analyst and returned to the agenda. She came back 7 minutes later. She had printed something. She was carrying it in both hands, which she did not usually do. She usually carried documents in one hand and had the other free, because she was always moving between tasks. Both hands meant she had stopped moving. She had stood somewhere and held the document and thought about how to bring it to me, and then she had come. She set it on the table without speaking first. I picked it up the way I pick up every document without looking up from what I was reading. Then I looked up. It was the transmission origin log for the FENWICK broadcast. 228 nodes. Simultaneous activation. Confirmed origin point. The human delegation's communication terminal, currently logged out of the Accord system following the session's close. Filed under Envy Principal Vreth session credentials. Timestamp 1403. 1403. I read it twice. I read it a third time. The numbers did not change. 1403 was 4 minutes before she picked up the flask, 4 minutes before she took the slow sip, 4 minutes before she walked out, 4 minutes before I looked up from entering her departure in the session log. Envy Principal Vreth withdrew without recognition and felt the particular satisfaction of a formal record accurately completed. She had sent it before I said the words I was most proud of. I became aware of my throat sac. The bioluminescence had dropped out. I could feel it the way you feel a sound stop, not a new sensation, but the absence of a familiar one. My species cannot control this. When certainty collapses past a specific threshold, the light goes. I had known this about myself my entire life. I had never, in 22 years in this chamber, experienced it during a session. I was aware that the solving observer in the 7th ring could see it from where she was sitting. I did not look at her. I called an emergency session. I called it in the formal language. The precise, correct, procedurally complete language I had used 100 times before because the language was what I had. I had 47 minutes of prepared remarks on procedural integrity. I had precedents. I had 3 separate Accord articles that governed unauthorized broadcast events. I had a 22-year record in this chamber. I said none of them. Kurathsal stood. She did not request recognition. She did not raise a point of order. She did not wait for me to acknowledge her. She simply stood, 206 years old, compound eyes moving through amber to the deep red-brown I had not seen before and did not have language for. And the room gave her the floor the way rooms give the floor to people who have earned it through every possible means, except the ones the room officially recognizes. She began to read names. 6,200 names. She read them slowly. She had 206 years of patience, and she used every year of it, each name given its full weight, the full time it took to say, the full silence between it and the next one. The chamber acoustics, those same acoustics I had been using for 22 years, made each name last a half-second longer than it would have lasted outside. 6,200 names. Before the first name was finished, the 7 aligned species had seconded the formal review call. She kept reading. I said nothing for 11 minutes. The session clerk recorded the silence. I did not ask them not to. I understood by then, sitting in the place where I had dissolved 4 civilizations from Accord standing, that everything was going into the permanent record. That had always been the point. Not the broadcast alone, not the names alone, not the coalition alone, the record. A record filed completely enough and patiently enough does not just document an event. It becomes the event. It becomes the only version that exists. I had spent 22 years filing records. I had not understood until that moment that someone else had been doing the same thing, for longer with more care. They had built the room before I knew it was a room. He had no fleet, no weapons, no leverage I recognized. She had walked out of my chamber carrying a dented metal flask, and 37 years of work had already been sent before she picked it up. I tried in those 11 minutes to identify the single moment I should have seen it coming, the one place where the pattern had been visible, where a careful observer would have noticed. I could not find one. That was the answer. There was no single moment. That was the entire architecture. The Accord voted without the Dominion bloc. This was not unprecedented. I had seen it happen twice in 22 years. What was unprecedented was the margin. When a formal review is opened by unanimous seconding from the full peripheral compact and confirmed by simultaneous broadcast verification, the procedural math becomes very simple. Majority is not close. The full review was opened in 40 minutes. I filed 3 procedural objections in the following 72 hours. Each one was answered before it finished processing. Exhibit 313, Exhibit 314, Exhibit 315. My systems analyst stopped telling me about them after the third. She told me she had set up an automatic notification so I could check when I chose to, and I did not have to see them in real time. I did not thank her for this. I should have. That is the kind of thing you notice later. The Rithani Dominion retained formal Accord membership. The review board made that clear in their preliminary findings. This was a procedural correction, not a dissolution. I had dissolved 4 civilizations from standing in this chamber, and the board wanted me to understand that they were not doing what I had done. They said this with care. The care was worse than the statement would have been without it. 3 Dominion procedural precedents were suspended pending the full review. The block veto was suspended. The platform offset amendment was reclassified. A solving clerk in the Accord's Records Division spent 4 hours writing the reclassification language. I know this because the reclassification document contains a time-stamped revision history. The clerk wrote 6 drafts in those 4 hours, each one slightly more precise than the last, until the language was exactly right. The final classification reads, documented use of architectural filing as deliberate intimidation instrument against marginal signatory delegation. 4 hours, 6 drafts. I had written the original amendment in 11 minutes. The platform offset reclassification is now in the permanent record, cross-reference to Exhibit 1 of the CARTFALL counterfiling archive, which is the original 9-minute acceptance window for the Vessel 11 incident. The cross-reference was Vithran's idea. He had planned it 4 years before the session. It means that anyone who pulls the incident record for Vessel 11, anyone, at any point, for as long as the Accord's records exist, will find the platform offset reclassification 1 click away. He told me this later in writing. He did not have to, he did it anyway. 6 months after the session, they built a corridor. The memorial corridor of the Vithran Accord Hall had not existed before. It was a structural amendment filed by the Peripheral Compact Coalition 48 hours after the broadcast, a proposal to convert an unused lobby passage into a permanent installation. The Accord approved it in 9 days. The construction took 11 weeks. The stone used for the wall came from the same quarry as the floor of the Grand Chamber. Pale, cold, old stone that made sound last longer than it should. 20,200 names. 6,200 on the upper section. A small notation beside each name, Colony Transport Vessel 11. Then below that, 14,000 more arranged by species, by incident, by date. 8 species. 22 suppressed incidents. 40 years of archived grievance made permanent in pale stone. 1 line at the bottom in the Accord's formal script. Let the record show. Vreth stood in front of it on the day the corridor opened. She had not spoken at the formal dedication. There had been speakers. Kurathsal had said something brief that made 3 delegates cry and 1 Accord archivist write it down in full by hand and file it as a personal document rather than an official one. Tarasas had stood in the back and drunk water from a paper cup, because there was no tea. Rencall had attended for exactly 40 minutes and then left to catch a transit, because there was always something that needed checking. Vithran had stood next to Vreth. They had not spoken for a long time. He was holding a container of something he had brought from his office. The same habit, the container of food he would heat but not eat, the hand occupied so the rest of him could be still. He did not open it. They stood together and looked at the wall. After a long time, she said, quietly to no particular part of the room, we were not the loudest species in that chamber. We were not the fastest. We were the ones who understood that a record, filed completely enough, becomes the only argument anyone ever needs to have. He said nothing. He did not need to. I did not attend the dedication. I filed a written acknowledgement, 2 paragraphs. Procedurally correct language, formal recognition of the memorial's establishment, formal note of the Accord's role in the review process, formal expression of the Rithani Dominion's continued commitment to the Accord's stated principles of fair representation. I wrote it the way I write everything, with precision, without error. My systems analyst told me, the day after the dedication, that the acknowledgement had been received by the Accord's records office. I said, was it filed? She said, yes. I said, under what reference number? She said, Exhibit 313. I did not respond to that. The message from Kurath Sol arrived at 300. Not to Vithrin this time, to Vreth. The same hour, 300 station time, the hour she had used for serious conversations for as long as anyone in the compact had known her. The message was short. It said only, "Now I understand why you kept the photograph." Vreth read it once. She did not reply. The photograph was already somewhere else, pressed into the cornerstone of the memorial corridor, the stone at the base of the wall below the first name, below the notation that read Colony Transport Vessel 11. She had placed it there herself, during the 11 weeks of construction, on a day when the workers were on a break, and the corridor was empty. She had peeled the tape off the corner of her desk slowly, the way you peel something you have been careful with for a long time. She had carried the photograph to the station, and pressed it into the mortar before it set. The passengers behind the glass were blurs of warmth. They would remain blurs of warmth for longer than anyone who had known their names was still alive. No one would find the photograph without taking the wall apart. That was the point. She walked out of the corridor into the lobby. Vithrin walked beside her. She was carrying the flask. She had set it on the railing that morning the way she set it on every railing, in every session, in 37 years of sessions. She had not drunk from it during the dedication. She had not drunk from it in any session in 37 years, not once in the whole of it during the work. She picked it up now and held it at her side, and the lobby was wider than the memorial corridor, and the sound moved differently in the wider space, and the flask made no sound in her hand. The wall held every name it had been built to hold. It would hold them without her help now,